For those of you that have trouble with reading response number 2, either you didn't get it, it didn't happen, whatever, I don't care. Just send it to me whenever, okay? Like, I don't care about it being late, like, it doesn't matter. You don't have to send me a thing about what happened, I don't need it. Just send it to me. Submit it to Canvas, I won't count it as late. Just upload it. Reading response number 2 was due Friday. Pretend it's due this coming Friday. And then the paper coming due this Friday. If you need an extension on something, let me know. I'm happy to give you a little bit of rope here, right? I don't want to give you so much that you get behind, right? We have a tight schedule over the next couple of weeks in terms of like points coming in for you, right? Now the reading response, so the second reading response was on Friday, right? Your first paper was this Friday. We're taking an exam on Thursday of next week, right? So we've got a lot coming up. So I understand that. If I can do what I can to give you as much grace before that first exam, reach out to me and let me know so that I can say yes, make a note of it in Canvas, and we can keep track of everything. For those of you that missed reading response 2, because of the weather, because of whatever reason, because you whoopsie-daisy and forgot, totally fine. Get the reading response to me this week, right? By Thursday, by Friday. Okay, I'll take it until Friday night. I encourage you to do it beforehand so you can focus on your paper. Right? If you need the weekend to finish that, let me know. Right? Just reach out to me and ask for what you need to be able to finish up this work. Any questions about this? Does that make sense, what I'm saying? If you missed it, don't sweat it. Do it now, send it to me. Looking at the syllabus, you can anticipate what's happening this week and what's happening next week, so you kind of know what's coming. So we feel good about it. On Thursday, we're going to talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young, Goodman, and Brown. Cotton Mather reading is on there. I'll talk a little bit about Cotton Mather. I'll talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials in general. Nathaniel Hawthorne is what we're going to focus our time and attention on that class. The longer reading, it's really good. It is not in volume A. This is volume A. It's the green one. The blue one, the big fat blue one, is volume B. We're jumping out of volume A for a short period of time to get to volume B. We're going to read Hawthorne, who's writing in the 19th century, so he's writing about the time period we're entering into. So it's kind of a nice way of getting into the time period while at the same time getting somebody who's writing from the 19th century. Young, Goodman, Brown is the first piece of straight fiction that we've read. It's going to feel a lot like literature suddenly, in that traditional sense. It's going to feel like a short story. You'll be like, oh, this is wild, this is really fun. It's really fun, it's really weird. I encourage you to sit down and try to read it in a sitting. It's a little confusing, that's partially what it's after. It wants you to be like, is this a dream? Is this reality? What's happening here? Like, it very much wants you to have that experience, so lean into it. So bring volume B to class, having read Nathaniel Hawthorne, Young, Goodman, Brown. Young, Goodman, Brown is the last thing that we're reading before our exam. Young, Goodman, Brown will be on our exam for sure. Okay. Questions about any of this? Just in terms of assignments, where we are, what's going down the line. Last class, we moved to the poems of Anne Bradstreet. The 10th muse lately sprung up in America from 1650. We talked about this as the first piece of the first collection of poems written in America, not just by a woman, but by an American period. We talked about the division between the private and the public poems, as well as the double voicedness that several of her poems produce. Her poems help make clear, I tried to argue, that there's a real conflict that's inherent in living life in a Puritan colony, right? It's not just all straight-laced rules, right? People are complicated, people are real, people are human, right? You're supposed to do one thing, but you can't always do it the way you're supposed to do it. That doesn't mean everybody did it just like that, right? I want you to see in those poems a woman who's grieving for the loss of her grandchild. I want you to see in those poems a woman who's grieving over the loss of her home and trying to make sense of it, trying to come to terms with it, trying to take it on the chin, trying to recognize, like, God giveth and God taketh away, like, I can get over this, but also really feeling like I was doing so much good work with that house. I was raising my children in that place, right? I was being hospitable to strangers and to neighbors in that place. Like, that is where everything that I understand about what it means to be a good person and a good human in the world, I was doing it all. I was operated out of that home. Like, why would you take that thing away from me, right? Questioning this, struggling with this. I want you to see that, like, doctrinal consolation, right? Like, approved consolation in grief begins to help her less and less across the poem. There are poems where she's really taken it. She's got it. Grief is something she can kind of handle. She's grieving, but like she's got it under control. And places where that grief kind of rises up, she She doesn't know what to do with it. She's kind of ultimately coming to a place of acceptance. Sort of at the end, it feels a little hesitant. Today we're turning our attention to Mary Rowlandson. A true history of the captivity and restoration of Mary Rowlandson, the minister's wife in New England. This isn't in your Norton. I teach different versions of this at different times because there's a lot of really neat preparatory material written by a minister who basically does a bunch of work justifying why this exists. Again, having to justify a woman's writing in the first place, right? The minister says she wasn't trying to get famous, she's not trying to be an author, she wrote this for herself, to remember her experience, right? And she says this, to remember how God dealt with me, right? To think about mercy, to think about justice, to think about punishment, right? To think about what she learned for herself and for her family. But somebody else happened to read it. You know, she told about it to a friend who read it. He's like, oh my goodness, people have to read this. You're going to do so much good in the world. The ministers approve, right? Thumbs up. The ministers are like, totally fine. We're okay with this, right? There's a lot of signaling that has to get done in order for her work to come out. I say that because I'm really interested in places where clearly Mary Rowlandson in this narrative is writing for a reader. I think there are real places where she wants to make clear she's not just writing for herself, right? Despite the minister saying she's just doing this for herself, this is just a private document that we've approved for circulation in the public space, as opposed to recognizing actually there seems to be some awareness of a readership here. And this woman speaking to that readership above what the ministers say is actually happening. Right? Any of those hot pages I want you to see? Yeah, so you can see that. You can see some of this laid out here, right? So just that summary. Wherein is set forth the cruel and inhuman usage that underwent amongst the heathens for 11 weeks of time and her deliverance from them. Written by her own hand for her private uses, right? Written by her own hand for herself, right? And now made public at the earnest desire of some friends for the benefit of the afflicted, right? So the idea here is like some friends, it's similar to what you see in the Bradstreet poems, right? Some friends took my poems, sent them to England, got them published. They shouldn't have done that, but they did, and here you are, my little book, right? Written for somebody else. There's a sermon attached to this, right? Printed in New England, so now we've got printing presses all set up. We're cruising. I do want you to see very much the framing that has to happen around it, right? For this to become socially acceptable, like public consumption and public circulation has to be justified. I want to talk about these two maps. I'm going to show you these two maps. We're talking about the Wampanoag a lot here in this piece. We're talking about this map over here where you see Canada. This map on the kind of lower left side, this little legend here on the lower left. Where you see the kind of states superimposed on this. This is the area that we're talking about. It's over here. Right? This is Nantucket. You know this Martha's Vineyard. This is that kind of like heel of Massachusetts that swings up. This is the Wampanoag territory from 1620. Right? This kind of, again, I didn't have this map, but it presented. Right? This is kind of loosely what we understand. Traditional Wampanoag land claims to be these places. This is the background. King Philip's War is what this is called. King Philip, aka Metacom, right? 1675, June to August 1676, a little bit over a year. What precipitated this is not a single event, right? History can't get boiled down to this one thing happened and this thing happened, right? It's not how it works. It's years of things building up and building up and building up, and then something happens and that becomes the kind of powder keg that starts something, right? Something much more significant that needs to happen. The English colonists have been arriving in New England and increasingly taking over land. Right? They're no longer just coming out and bartering and getting land, a la John Smith, and like, here, you guys can live over here. I'm going to give that space to you. We're going to be kin. You're now basically kind of a part of my community. You can have this land. We're going to trade. It's all going to be good. We're not doing that anymore. Right? Colonists are arriving. They're staking the land claims. So increasingly, Native Americans in this world, the Wampanoag, the Algonquin-speaking people, so often we group Native Americans into larger affiliations based on language groups. So the Algonquin-speaking language group here, of which the Wampanoag are a part, are increasingly losing land. They're losing their sovereignty over their land, which is also encroaching on their food supplies. They don't have the same hunting grounds they did, right? As you will see in Mary Rowlandson's text, a lot of their crops and a lot of their cultivated lands have been burned and destroyed by colonists who want them to die off. Right? Like, very clearly, that's the plan, right? How do we kill and exterminate as many native peoples as possible, destroy their food supplies? is one of the choices the colonists made, right? So in response to 3 Wampanoag men who were executed in Plymouth, it's kind of how history was held as this. This is also a lot of response to land encroachment, right? The destruction of food pathways, right? Of the ability to kind of sovereignly lay claim to this land and not being respected. So 3 Wampanoag men get executed, and that becomes like the last strike, right? So 3 Wampanoag men are executed in Plymouth, and King Philip's War really kicks off. Think about it as a series of raids all across New England, attempts to destroy colonial settlements, right? Places where, like, you know, a handful of people had set up shops, or small communities of people were beginning to build houses that native people were rolling into, and then destroying those villages, right? Reclaiming that land for themselves. So in this year, this like just over a year, we think 1,200 English houses are destroyed, of which one of them is Mary Rowlandson's, right? Mary Rowlandson is kind of the best account we have of somebody who's on the ground while this is happening. So 1,200 English houses are destroyed. Over the course of this, again, this kind of just over a year, 3,000 Native Americans are killed. 600 colonists are killed. Metacom is one of the Native people who is killed. He is killed, and his wife and his children are then sold into slavery into the West Indies and the Caribbean after this. So again, as we think about enslavement in this early American space, and we'll continue to talk about this and broaden this conversation as we get into the captivity of African peoples from West Africa. Think about enslavement as something, again, Columbus is very, very interested in. We need people to work, we've got people to work, right? Native peoples are also a part of this early conversation. It's easy to kind of bounce over this we're talking about. Please.
This might be a really dumb question, but
That's a great question.
But she wrote this after she got back with the colonists, right?
That's
She
correct.
wasn't writing this during.
That's correct. Yes. This is a recollection. So she does survive, right? She's basically ransomed. Is really how this goes. So one of the ways I think about this is there's this moment kind of before all of this called the Great Swamp Massacre, in which a lot of Native peoples died. And in the Great Swamp Massacre, which happens in Narragansett territory, hundreds of women and children were killed in this. Native leaders began taking women and children, and English women and children captive. It's kind of what we kind of feel and understand historically when it precipitated this moment, right? Women and children become captive at this like really increased rate as a way of Native peoples trying to protect their community from like ambush, more or less. The idea being like, hey, if we have English women and children in the community, right, we're gonna be way less likely that a bunch of people will just sneak in at night and burn everything down. English won't just sneak up on us and shoot at random at everybody. Right? We have some leverage. We have a little bit of protection, right? And then we can also basically sell and trade off those who we capture, right? So we can ransom them down the road for money, or for food, or for other prisoners. We do prisoner exchanges, right? That's the thing that still exists. We still do this, right? Prisoner exchanges is a real part of our warfare. So this is kind of the rough outline. Rowlandson, her village, her house is attacked in 1676 in February. Right? So towards the tail end of this, right, we have March, April, May, June, July, August. 5 months, the last 5 months of this, right, is when Rowlandson is captive. Francis Rowe Kessler is a scholar who wrote a book called The Indian Captivity Narrative, A Woman's View, in 1990. Has identified approximately 500 narratives published in at least 1,200 editions during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Right? The captivity narrative becomes a kind of actual genre, right? A lot of captivity happening. Some of it fiction, some of it nonfiction, right? A great deal of nonfiction, lots of accounts of people being captive. The narratives are written by men and women who were held captive by various tribes during the centuries of conflict between the European colonizers and American Indians. So from the 17th century to the 19th century, tons of captivity narratives. A lot of them true, like first-hand accounts of people who were captive for a while. It's important to remember that population decimations have already hit indigenous communities in New England. So we talk about 3,000 Native Americans killed. It's a huge number, right? It's devastating to the Wampanoag. But because massive amounts of death have already occurred through contact with other European diseases have moved to a lot of these communities and killed off huge numbers of the population. So losing 3,000 Wampanoag people, losing Metacom, right, fractures the Wampanoag in a really profound way. It is a really important military victory
by the English as it relates to their desire to colonize the space. Devastating to Wampanoag, but does present a real kind of existential crisis to the colonists. Right? They recognize how powerful consolidated native work could be, and power could be. Right? If native communities were really working together in a systematic way across the eastern seaboard, right, the colonists wouldn't really stand much of a chance against these kind of organized communities. Okay. So this is the area of Massachusetts. So again, so kind of traditional territory of the Wampanoag area of Massachusetts, right? This imposed on it. Where this red dot is Lancaster. This is where Mary Rowlandson starts. I'm gonna skip a couple slides and I'll bounce back around to this. But this map I pulled from Lisa Brooks, an incredible scholar who's still working now, who just recently put out this book called Beloved Kin, which actually rethinks King Philip's War in a literary sense, doing really amazing work in the kind of indigenous studies space. She belongs to Algonquin language speaking groups. She put together this map and did this project that's linked on your syllabus. You could find just by searching Our Beloved Kin, where she traveled to all these different sites. Right? She built this kind of simple website to go along with her book. It's really simple, but the idea is she's trying to show these as real places, right? As significant places where they cross the river. Because one of the things we learned is Mary Rowlandson doesn't really know where she is. She's really lost through most of her captivity. Right? She talks about, we move vaguely up and down, right? When in fact, Brooks wants to make it really clear. She was moving through really clear pathways set out by Wampanoag people, right? Moving to major and minor Wampanoag settlements and places where they traded, crossing major waterways. There are marked places within native traditions of which Rowlandson has no idea, right? Reasonably so. But the idea is that if we take Rowlandson's word on it, you see they didn't really know, they were just kind of moving randomly in the woods, when in fact, scholars now know really clearly that they were moving down really determined pathways. So this marks off, each of these numbers is one of her removes, right? This is where she starts her first remove. This is the second remove, right? It's a big long one. Third remove, right? Fourth, fifth, and so on, right? So she's not wrong. They are moving north and south, east and west. But this is a much clearer pathway of what Rowlandson actually went on during her captivity, where she swings up and comes back down. I'll come back to this. Bear with me as I'm trying to compress two different lectures into one. I'm just kind of moving through, making sure I'm covering what I want to set up here. So 1620, we talked about the Pilgrims establishing Plymouth. That's on Wampanoag land, right? That's for 50 years past that moment, right? Level of meditation in Bradford. We know that the Wampanoag had as many as 40,000 people in the 1600s across 67 villages, right? That made up what they refer to as the Wampanoag Nation, right? The Wampanoag Nation as being a collection of multiple groups of at least 67 functioning villages and around 40,000 people. It covers all of this land that I was showing you earlier, right? This is where these 40,000 people spread out and hunted and lived, and farmed in this territory. Starts off quick. On the 10th of February, 1675, came the Indians with great numbers upon Lancaster. Their first coming was about sunrise. Hearing the noise of some guns, we looked out. Several houses were burning, and the smoke ascending to heaven. There were 5 persons taken in one house: a father and a mother and a sucking child. They knocked on the head. The other 2 they took and carried away alive. There were 2 others who, being out of their garrison upon some occasion, were set upon. One was knocked on the head. The other escaped. Another there was one running along, was shot and wounded and fell down. Begged him for his life, promising him money, as they told me, but they would not hearken to hear him, and knocked him in the head, and stripped him naked, and split open his bowels. Just hits real hard, real fast, right? In this moment of her encounter with this attack on her village. One thing she marks here on page 270, we had 6 stout dogs belonging to our garrison, but none of them would stir. Though another time, if any Indian had come to the door, they were ready to fly upon him and tear him down. The Lord hereby would make us more knowledgeable of his hand, and to see that our help is always in him. what's she saying? This is a small moment that I'll come back to more generally. But what do you see her saying here? What's the relationship between the dogs and God's hand and all of this?
That he controls what happens to him.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Rowlandson tries really hard to make sense of what's happening to her. She needs it to make sense. Right? There's so much trauma, so much violence. She tries to make sense of this with what she has and the best she can. She says that the dogs that belong to our community, right? We have 6 big dogs. And when someone comes up into this village, they get crazy. Strangers don't come in here, right? We have 6 big dogs that this whole crew rolled in and the dogs didn't do anything, right? For her, this is the first time that something is intervening, right? That God's hand here, right? You put your trust in these dogs, your only safety is in me, right? Is what she says, is what she's saying here, right? The Lord hereby would make us the more knowledgeable, the Lord would hereby make us the more knowledge his hand, and to see that our help is always in him, right? The dogs didn't bark. She didn't that's divine intervention, not in a positive way, right? But in a like, check yourself way, right? The dogs didn't bark. You were putting your trust and your faith in the protection of these dogs. You should have put your trust and faith in the protection of the Lord. Right? Is what Rowlandson's beginning to say. She lays out this paragraph of violence, right? The bottom of this paragraph, oh, the doleful sight that now is to behold of this house. She talks about the death that she sees, the violence that she sees, right? There were 24 of us taken alive and carried captive. I had often before this said that if the Indians should come, I should choose rather to be killed by them than be taken alive. But when it came to trial, my mind changed. Their glittering weapons so daunted my spirit that I chose rather to go along with those, as I may say, ravenous beasts, that moment in my days. And that I may be the better declare what happened to me during the grievous captivity. I shall particularly speak to the several removes we've had up and down the wilderness. Your first indication up and down the wilderness. First remove. Now away we must go with those barbarous creatures, with our bodies wounded and bleeding, and our hearts no less than our bodies. A la John Smith, oh, the roaring and singing and dancing and yelling of those black creatures in the night which made the place a lively resemblance of hell. And as miserable was the waste that had there made of horses, cattle, sheep, swine, calves, lambs, roasting pigs, and fowl, which they had plundered in town, some roasting, some lying, burning, some boiling to feed our merciless enemies. There remained nothing to me, she says at the end of this opening paragraph, there remained nothing to me but one poor wounded babe, and it seemed at present worse than death, but it was in such a pitiful condition. Bespeaking compassion, I had no refreshing for it, no suitable thing to revive it. Little did many think what is the savageness and brushness of this barbarous enemy, I, even those that seem to profess more than others among them, when the English have fallen into their hands. We find out that one of the native people carries her wounded child on a horse during the second remove. Third remove. Oh, the number of pagans, now merciless enemies, that came about me, this transition from pagans to enemies, right? We begin to compress in different ways for her. We begin to think of past sins. The next day was the Sabbath, she says at the bottom of 272. I then remembered how careless I had been of God's holy time, how many Sabbaths I had lost and misspent, how evilly I had walked in God's sight, which lay so close into my spirit. It was easy for me to see how righteous it was with God to cut off the thread of my life and cast me out of his presence forever. Yet the Lord showed mercy to me and upheld me, and as he wounded me with one hand, so he healed me with the other. Right? Rowlandson begins to think about this as like a real trial, right? A real personal trial given to her by God to endure, right? So on the one hand, she begins to recognize this relationship that she's being not tested, right? But kind of refined by God, punished to a certain degree, right? While at the same time being held up in the face of that punishment, right?
in the face of that judgment. She says in the paragraph 273 here, the second one, this was the comfort I had from them. Miserable comforters are ye all, as he said. Thus 9 days I sat upon my knee with the babe in my lap, till my flesh was raw again, my child being even ready to depart this sorrowful world. They bade me carry it out from another wigwam, whither I went with a very heavy heart. And down I sat with the picture of death in my lap. About 2 hours in the night, my sweet little babe like a lamb to depart this life on February 18, 1675, it being about 6 years and 5 months old. It was 9 days from the first wounding, in this miserable condition without any refreshing of one nature or another except a little cold water. I cannot but take notice how at another time I could not bear to be in the room where any dead person was, but now this case changed. I must and could lie down with my dead babe, side by side, all the night after. I have sought since the wonderful goodness of God to me in preserving me in the use of my reason and senses in that distressing time, that I did not use wicked violence means to end my own miserable life. This is really not her lowest point necessarily, but really one of them. The native people, however, take her child and bury it high up on a hill. She articulates this a little bit on 273. When I came and asked them what they had done with the child, with the child's body, they told me it was up upon the hill. And they went and showed me where it was, where I saw the ground was newly digged. And there they told me they had buried it. There I left that child in the wilderness, and must commit it and myself also to this wilderness condition, to him who is above all. Now, she has 2 other children who are also captive, right? Older kids, who are separated from her. But she's allowed to visit, right? She's periodically allowed to move, kind of with a real sense of autonomy, to go visit her children who are captive. She also says a really important thing down here at the end that I'd like to pay attention to. She talks about the kind of how difficult it was to hear native people bragging about their victories, right? To hear them celebrating that they had kind of been victorious in these attacks, that, the men had groveled for their lives, and that they had, been so victorious and so valiant in battle. Those that were there with us at home were gathered together as soon as they heard the hooping, and every time that the other went over their number, those that gave a shout, and every earth rung again. And thus they continued till those that had been upon the expedition were come to the Sagamore's wigwam, and then of the hideous insulting and triumphing that there was over some Englishmen's scalps that they had taken and brought with them. I cannot but take notice of the wonderful mercy of God to me in those afflictions, in sending me a Bible. One of the Indians that came from the Medfield fight had brought some plunder, came to me and asked me if I would have a Bible. He had gotten one in his basket. I was glad of it and asked him whether he thought the Indians would let me read. He answered yes. So I took the Bible, and in that melancholy time, it came into my mind to read first the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, which I did. When I had read it, my dark heart wrought out on this manner. There was no mercy for me, that the blessings were gone, and the curses come in their room, and that I had lost my opportunity. But the Lord helped me still to go on reading till I came to chapter 30, the seventh first verse, where I found there was a mercy promise again, if we would return to him by repentance. And though we were scattered from one end of the earth to the other, the Lord would gather us together, and turn all those curses upon our enemies. I do not desire to live to forget this scripture, and what comfort it was to me. Did you guys give them the Bible? Several things I want you to see. Rowlandson gets great comfort from this Bible for the rest of this experience, right? And she reads it often in this manner, right? She'll often open it up, and her eyes will kind of land on a verse, and she'll read that out, and she'll decide, this is what God wanted me to see, right? This is the message that I needed in this moment. Sometimes it works, and she's like, this is just what I needed to hear. Other times, it does not work for her, and she has a lot of issues and questions around why God isn't kind of communicating to her through the Bible in the ways that she wishes that they would. Another thing that's important to pay attention to is the native recognition of English culture. Right? There are at this point converted Christian native men. There are native men and women who speak English. Right? There is cultural awareness of what English life is. So they have a Bible, right? And know this may provide some kind of comfort to this woman. Right? There is a kind of act of generosity in this. Right? She's captive. I'm aware of that. Child just died. But I don't want you to miss this, right? The kind of awareness that this is, right? It's to bring scripture to a captive English person and say, do you want them? And the kind of comfort that it provides her, right? It becomes a really, really valuable possession for her moving forward. She parts from her daughter Mary during the fourth remove, who I never saw again until I saw her in Dorchester return from captivity. She doesn't see Mary anymore during this. Right? She only sees Mary after their captivity, when they're both released, after the war is over. Fifth remove. I really want to get to this one. I think it's really important. The occasion, as I thought, of their moving at this time was the English army, it being near and following them. For they went as if they had gone, for their lives some considerable way, and made to stop. I'm going to pull up this map, just so you can kind of see where she is. The fifth removed. So she's here, at this waterway, right? Up to the sixth. The first week of my being among them, this is on 277 in that last big long paragraph. I'm going to read a bunch from this paragraph. The first week of my being among them, I hardly ate anything. The second week I found my stomach grow very faint for want of something, and yet it was very hard to get down there, filthy trash. The third week, though I could think how formerly my stomach would turn against this or that I would starve and die before I could eat such things, yet they were sweet and savory to my taste. Food. There's food scholarship, and Rowlandson shows up a lot. She does some weird stuff with food, right? He talks about this. Not being able to eat native food, right? It's just trash, he says. Until a couple weeks in, and she's real hungry, and all of a sudden, food starts tasting really better, right? You're hungry enough, you'll eat anything, right? It'll be sweet and savory to your taste. She begins to eat again for the first time. There was at this time knitting a pair of white cotton stockings for my mistress, right? Her mistress here is the native woman who's been kind of put in charge of her. She'll talk about her later. Rowlandson's not a great storyteller in terms of identifying who these characters are. Much later on, we figure out who this woman is. She's actually a really high-ranking leader within the native community in Weedomu, a kind of military leader and a strategist in her own way, right? Who is in charge of a lot of people, and not just Rowlandson, but is kind of like one of the main leaders. Who's basically like this woman's in charge of what happens to you. When the Sabbath came, they bade me go to work. I told them that it was a Sabbath day and desired to let them rest. They told them that they would do whatever. You're not going to rest, you're going to work. Here, I cannot but take notice of the strange providence of God. Now, this is a phrase I want you to pay attention to. The strange providence of God in preserving the heathen. Right? Strange providence being something about trying to understand why has God done this. Right? Providence being God's ordering of things in the world. It's a strange providence, right? Not glorious providence, not incredible providence, but like strange providence. In preserving the heathen. They were many hundreds, old and young, some sick and some lame, and many had children on their backs. The great number of this time were with us were women. This word is now considered a super pejorative, super unkind term, right? So women, with us were women. They traveled with all they had, bag and baggage, and yet they got over this river aforesaid. And on Monday they set their wigwams on fire, and away they went. On that very day came the English army after them to this river, and saw the smoke of their wigwams, and yet this river put a stop to them. Right, so this river, what we're talking about right here, they cross this river. God did not give them courage or activity to go after us. We were not ready for so great a mercy as victory and deliverance. If we had been, God would have found a way out for the English to have passed this river, as well as for the Indians with their women and their children and all their luggage. Alright, so what's up? What's she saying? What's worth getting right? We're cruising. Okay. What's happening?
He's amazed by the fact that God's letting them escape when the English are so close to getting her.
Good. It doesn't make sense to her. She's like, here I am with a bunch of sick, lame, women, children, and old men carrying all that they own, and they all cross this river. No big deal. The English army rolls up. She can see them. It's the moment of her deliverance. This is it. Captivity over. They won't cross the river. They
They can't cross the river, right? God did not give them courage or activity to go over after us. As pronouns begin to slide, right? Us is English captive folks, but also her, the us, the we of the larger Native community. Right? She doesn't think about herself as a Native person, right? I'm not saying that, but like her pronouns slide. And then us, we, them, it's really interesting here. We were not ready for so great a mercy as victory and deliverance. Her only explanation, we weren't ready yet. We weren't ready to be delivered. We hadn't learned our lessons yet. Right? We hadn't gotten out of this experience what God wanted us to get out of. Or if we had, they would have crossed the river no problem. But they didn't. This is what she means by strange providence. Right? She doesn't understand. I cannot but take notice of the strange providence of God in preserving the heathen. Right? How does God let them do this? 6 removed. You see this another turn, right? 3 or 4 lines down. But there were others till they came to a beaver dam, and I amongst them, where through the good providence of God I did not wet my foot. I went along that day, mourning and lamenting, leaving farther my own country, and traveling into a vast and howling wilderness. And I understood something of Lot's wife's temptation when she looked back. She's in the wilderness now, into a howling wilderness, right? She's now leaving the army, right? This is her chance at delivery. She sees the English army on the other side of the river, and they don't cross. And for her, this is this kind of like door shutting, right? She's now she's moving into a new space, right? She's moving into the wilderness in this real way. And this is where I turn to make sense of this from this scholar, right? Lisa Brooks, in this, the new history of Philip IV. It's from a different piece, right? But a lot of this is really similar. And I buy Brooks' reading here in a real sense. Rather than critiquing this absence, right? Thinking about the absence of Native peoples in Rowlandson's account, right? She hasn't named anybody yet. They're just heathens and savages, right? And the beasts. Rather than critiquing this absence, I hope to offer an alternative lens for viewing Rowlandson's journey through Native space. My ambitious goal for this project is that no student or scholar will ever be able to read Rowlandson's text again without seeing a full cast of characters. Real people in complex relationships with each other, their families, their homelands, and the English who had recently entered their space. Too often we privilege what is known, New England, over what many do not know, the network of kinship and waterways that constitute Native space. Many readers of Rowlandson's narrative have only recently begun to acquire knowledge of these histories, texts, and places. In my own reading, I hope to demonstrate that foreignness is not only a product of social relations, but also of geographic relations, right? She wants to say, ironically, Rowland's captivity did not consist of confinement, right? She's not chained, she's not tied, she's not confined in a cage, she's not in prison, but rather a forced movement through unfamiliar space. Her description of the several removes we had up and down the wilderness reflect a discomforting lack of navigational orientation. Rather than moving west or north, on defined riverways or trails, the company, in her estimation, moved vaguely up and down. Her lack of geographic knowledge made the forested landscape a prison. Her captivity laid bare her foreignness to the land that she called home. Her narrative itself fosters an uneasy dialectic, as the foreign is made familiar and the indigenous is constructed as foreign. This last line is really tricky. These last 2 sentences, I think, are what's really profound about what Brooks is trying to offer. Her captivity laid bare her foreignness to the land that she calls home, right? English folks have come in and laid claim to this land. But Brooks wants to remind readers through Rowlandson that they didn't know anything about this place. They came in and claimed this land as their home and as their territory, but knew nothing about it. Her narrative fosters an uneasy dialectic. If you just pay attention to her side, her narrative fosters this tension. The foreign is made familiar.